Good morning, everyone. To those on the East Coast of North America, at least, good afternoon, good evening to many of our panelists and to many of you joining us today. Welcome to the University of Ottawa, and more specifically, a warm welcome from the Center for International Policy Studies. We are really looking forward to today's event, which is titled The Decolonial Challenge in African Studies. So my name is Philippe Fraud. I'm a professor in the School of Political Studies here at the university. So I'll be moderating this conversation today, which is part of the discussions that I think Black History Month particularly encourages us to have. So we should begin with a recognition that this event, even though we're gathering virtually, is taking place on unceded traditional land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So any discussion of decolonial approaches surely begins with some reflections on our context as settlers in Canada and many other places. So what does it mean to decolonize? Why is this debate resurgent today? How do debates about this link the academy and the politics of the world outside it? So these are some of the questions that we'll be tackling today. So I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming four scholars who are at the cutting edge of our thinking on coloniality in the academy and beyond, as well as decoloniality in the academy and beyond. So we have Dr. Yolande Bouka, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. Her research and teaching focus on gender, African politics and security, political violence, and field research ethics in conflict-affected societies. So she holds a Ph.D. in international relations from American University. So welcome, Yolande. We also have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Zoe Marks, who's a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research and teaching interests focus on the intersections of conflict and political violence, race, gender and inequality, peace building, and African politics. So welcome, Zoe. Good morning. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sabelo Ndlovu-Gacheni, who's professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South with an emphasis on Africa at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. He's a leading decolonial theorist with over 100 publications in the fields of African history, African politics, African development, and decolonial theory. So welcome, thanks for joining us, Sabelo. And last but not least, Dr. Awino Okech, who's a reader in gender studies at SOAS at the University of London. Her teaching and research interests lie in the nexus between gender, sexuality, and nation-state making projects as they occur in conflict and post-conflict societies. Good afternoon, Awino. Thanks for joining us. So thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion, which I've planned to cover three broad areas. So we're really looking at what does this mean to decolonize African studies? How should these movements intersect with kind of more mainstream initiatives around things like equality, diversity, inclusion? And then I think the final section of the discussion before we jump into the Q&A in about an hour's time is about the kind of practical questions around institutions. So again, about the role of journals, around the role of professional associations, and so on when we think about decolonial approaches in African studies. So without further ado, let's jump into the first kind of big question. And I think a lot of us today are kind of at the intersection of disciplines, and likely many of us and many of our people joining us are from international studies, or a phrase that I'm not quite a fan of, area studies. And so I certainly am. I'm an international relations person in a political studies department, but also have published in African studies journals and work in an African studies journal. So we are I'm encouraging a very sort of ecumenical approach to thinking through what we mean by African studies and how it intersects with some of our concerns about international life. So I'll begin with a bit of a provocation. So when we look at a recent article by the prominent African studies scholar Chris Clapham, he addresses this question of decolonizing and decolonization and says, "We find ourselves confronted by such a diverse and confusing range of claims that it becomes difficult to disentangle what decolonizing African studies actually means and what it's expected to achieve." So my first question, building on that perhaps provocatory statement, is what does it mean to decolonize African studies? Can we give some specificity to this question? And is this purely an academic exercise? So we'll begin with Yolande, maybe a minute or two, and then we'll go through and keep the conversation going.
It's an interesting provocation, so thank you. I am delighted to be amongst you all. And to answer the question, I think I'll answer the last part, which is it purely an academic exercise? And absolutely not. And I think While one may claim in a publication like the one you just cited that it's confusing, I think there's been a tremendous amount of work and activism that have outlined very a myriad of possibilities and avenues to decolonize African studies, whether we want to put it African studies with a capital A and a capital S, or small African studies, which is more of the everyday that is not necessarily academic. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to argue that it's confusing. The claims have been made for an emancipatory scholarship, but also about allowing Africans to simply be in the everyday. So um, I wouldn't be in a position to list in 90 seconds all the different ways in which we must decolonize African studies or other area studies. But what I do know is that articles and publication and scholars who appear to be confused are in fact erasing very clear outlines that have been offered by people in this very conversation about the history of the movement, whether we're talking about Pan-Africanism, whether we're talking about gendering our discipline, globalizing, and so forth, to the actual praxis pedagogically about decolonizing. So no, I'm not going to offer prescription, but I'm going to offer my other panelists an opening the door to discuss what is it actually, what are the consequences of somebody so prominent to make such claims, which therefore erase the work, the labor of over 100 years of mobilization, of intellectualization, of articulation of the movement in the diaspora and on the African continent.
Thanks for that. That's a good question. And in fact, Clapham's argument is built on a particular kind of historical mobilization that he does in that article. And he ends with a sort of confusion about, well, I thought decolonization happened already. Why is this being revived? So I take the point about your kind of confusion that you made earlier. Zoe, do you want to step in for a minute or two?
Absolutely. I feel as though I haven't done my homework because I haven't read the article. So I don't want to overreach, but I do really appreciate the provocation, and I appreciate my colleague Yolande's really sort of powerful reminder of what it means to ignore careful work that's been done diligently for decades in all of the outlets, right? Whichever sort of gaze or centricity you have. What I hear when people don't know what it is, or when they're confused, or when they make these sort of claims to the past, and when real decolonization happened, as though the decolonization that's ongoing is somehow detached from, or new, or separate from that unfinished struggle. I hear people thinking that decolonization is something that ends, and I hear people thinking that decolonization is something that can be contained. And so for me, when I think about decolonial work, it's something that has to be comprehensive, and it has to be messy, and it's never finished. And so, that's not to say that I have a sort of Afro-pessimist view on it. But I do think that people who take the kind of Clapham perspective are perhaps expecting there to be one thing that it means. And so in an effort to kind of marshal it and give structure that provides an entry point for folks who need analytic heuristics, my colleagues Shosi Kessi and Elawani Ramagondo and I edited a special issue where we provided an introduction that gives some of this sort of familiar analytic bones or scaffolding, if you will. And in that, rather than try to provide the catalog of everything that decoloniality needs to be, we provided these sort of 4 pillars of structural decolonization work. The epistemic decoloniality of actually beginning to kind of repopulate and transform hierarchies of knowledge. Personal decolonial praxis, which Elawani calls disobedient decolonial praxis, which I think really puts our finger on what's required against systems of power. And then last is relational. And so if you take structures, epistemologies, personal praxis, and relationships, that gives you a sense of why I say that it has to happen everywhere, and it's not going to be finished. And so for historians, that might be uncomfortable because we'd rather write about history as something that can end at some point, but you wouldn't be in business as a historian if you didn't think it was ongoing. And so that's my perspective, even as a political science on decoloniality, is that it's not confusing, it's just that it's comprehensive. And I look forward to hearing what others have to say.
Thanks for that. That's very important in terms of thinking through the range of different places where this happens, right? If this is comprehensive, but it's also kind of seemingly potentially unfinished and all-encompassing, then there is a range of different kind of institutions and forms of working, especially in African studies, that are potentially disrupted by this. So that's helpful for us to keep in mind as we go through. So I just want to give a couple of minutes as well for Sabelo to give his vision of this, what this means in terms of thinking about decolonizing African studies.
Okay, thank you, Yolande and Zoe for starting us off. Indeed, I actually read the article by Clapham, and I tried to respond directly to it by actually mapping some of the key aspects of the decolonization that fundamentally is a very expansive enterprise. It can't be what he was seeking. I don't think is reasonable at all to want to have a very neat definition of what decolonization, because is multiple and it operates at multiple levels. As Zoe has already said, that from their introduction to that critical studies, they then identify 4. And I identified about 10 Ds of the decolonial 10 in an attempt to respond to that. But I must say also that perhaps the question needed to be turned upside down. Who is confused? Because that is important. If he's confused, I'm not confused. So it depends. You are confused and where you stand and your positionality in understanding these issues. That's one. Secondly, we must also take into account that when we're talking about the subject of decolonization, whether in its epistemic or in its political or other dimensions, we're talking about something which emerges from the battlefield of history. And also we're talking about knowledges which are emerging really in struggles. And such knowledges can never be as smooth and as definite as those who think that is just intellectual curiosity. It's not really simple intellectual curiosity. It is also to do with the deep existential questions. So it's something which we need to take into account. And then the third point is that he also raises the issue of, he thought that the issue of decolonization was resolved maybe in the 1950s or 1960s. Again, there is something which we need to put forward straight away, and that is the issue of power reenacting the same problems over and over. And if power is reenacting the same problem over and over, it means that those who are fighting against that power, they need also to be resisting over and over. So it's an important point to take into account, because it also takes us to this other critique that perhaps the people doing decolonial work are repetitive. And the question is, indeed, they are repetitive, and they are repetitive. The question must not be they are repetitive. The question is, what is it that they are repeating and why are they repeating what they are repeating? Because I remember the historian Toyin Falola responding to that question of repetition, saying in African studies, we will not change scholarship just like we do fashion, our shirts and our dresses. As long as the problems remain the same, we can't just change for the sake of that. It became fashion, sort of. You become a fashionable scholar. Now this time there is this, then you move into that direction, and the problems remain the same. And then my last remark will be about perhaps to also link to his critique, I think we might also have to think about what about if we think about terms in African studies, that perhaps what he's talking about in the 1960s was a particular term, which for lack of a better term, we might call it the nationalist / Marxist term in African studies. It doesn't mean that therefore it exhausted all the issues which needed to be addressed in African studies. Let me leave it here for now.
Thanks so much for that. I think this point about, I mean, there are a number of really interesting points. I think the one that got me thinking empirically in particular was about this question of knowledge is emerging in struggle. And I think back to questions around Rhodes Must Fall and the linkage between those movements in South Africa and the ways that those became kind of transnationalized and had ramifications all around, including in Oxford. So lots to think through there. So last but not least, we go to Awino for your perspective on this question of what it means and what the specificity we can give to this question of decolonizing is.
Great, thanks. So let me make a decolonizing move by centering two African scholars on this. I was recently reading an old piece by Paul Zeleza from 1997 that was reflecting on the perpetual solitudes and crisis of African studies in the United States. And then many feminists will be familiar with Amina Mama's work on Is It Ethical to Study Africa? I think both of these pieces attend to very important questions, which is the origins of African studies, right? So what does decolonizing African studies mean? Recognizing those origins and asking, is it really useful to continue to cluster a continent, to cluster ways of knowing and understanding experiences of the continent in relation to the globe and in relation to global challenges? Is that a meaningful, useful academic enterprise endeavor? Now, if one argues that, yes, retaining African studies is a thing that people do, and I'm not an African studies scholar, I'm an African, who studies a range of things, right? Then the decolonizing of African studies means, what's your origin? What do we do about the original sin, if you will, that African studies has? How are the ways in which we are teaching African studies shifting to counter, the power dynamics, the power asymmetries of knowledge production, knowledge is about Africa in relation to Africa as part of a global intellectual project being shifted within this African studies of today. So that would be my response. Acknowledge the original sin, fix the original sin, and find ways to reimagine what African studies looks like at this particular moment. I come from a university that its own history is deeply implicated in this project of studying Africa. So part of the things that we started doing, for instance, is that we no longer spell out our name, right? Because we are not going to rebrand fully. So we simply just don't spell out our name. We call ourselves SOAS University of London. But part of the deeper political work that we've had to do in the institution, and no one is saying we're perfect, right? There are lots of asymmetries as well across the institution. But part of the deeper work that we've had to do is to turn around the ways in which we're teaching the regions that we're interested in and offer a much more critical engagement with knowledges from those contexts in relation to global challenges and questions of our time. So this is not about a sort of narrow nativist understanding of Africa, the Middle East, or Asia, but it's how the knowledges from that context allow us to understand the globe and vice versa.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, this is a really important point about the original sin, right? Which is that so many disciplines and interdisciplinary fields have reckoned in some ways. We think of anthropology, for example, doing this kind of self-critique, and perhaps we can look at the field of African studies and go, has that actually happened? And so a question that kind of comes to mind and throughout all of your different interventions in the last couple of minutes is about African studies and who it's kind of for. Because there's this idea that African studies should be by, for, with, of, on, and from Africa. To what degree is that actually the case? Perhaps we can go through the order again and begin with Yolande.
It's a good question, and I think it's a question that all of us on this panel have wrestled with and have engaged with our colleagues about. I really appreciate Awino's pointing out this question of the original sin, because it shapes very much the orientation of the discipline, whether we're talking about African studies in terms of literature, whether we're talking about African studies in terms of anthropology or international relations and comparative politics. And for me, it's a difficult question to answer, because on one hand, I think addressing the original sin and addressing the injustice that came with the original sins requires a centering of the discipline around Africa and its diaspora. And the reason why I bring in the diaspora is because there is an inseparable link between, people who stayed on the continent and people who were forcibly removed, or people who chose to leave by choice, their intellectual production, their orientation when it comes to studying issues of power, issues of identity that are often linked back to the continent regardless, yeah. So when I think about who African study should be for and by whom, I think ultimately it requires an acceptance and a radical acceptance of the agency of African scholars and the members of the diaspora in many ways to direct the direction of the scholarship. Now, that may be a little bit shocking because there are so many people who are involved in the scholarship. But if we look at what it was designed for to begin with, reimagining the possibilities of African studies, if we think it's a discipline worth saving, requires us to completely shift the orientation in terms of who determines the tenets, who determines the directions, and who determines the types of methods and epistemologies we're going to use and we're going to value. And the reason why I say that is because we're having many conversations across disciplines about what it means to decolonize. We have a focus on decentering Europe on the one hand, on the other, you have a push to use what are called indigenous ways of knowing. But as we're having these conversations and as people are trying to do these things, they're still pushed to the margin of the scholarship. They're not centered. And of course, here I'm speaking from somebody who is based in North America. So, the dynamics of somebody who's at University of Nairobi or, Nelson Mandela University may be very different, but still in the cosmology of the ecosystem of African studies, even these efforts remain on the margins. So to address, to link your question to the comment of Awino, who is it for? Then we have to interrogate who it was for in the origins. And if we're going to take a radical liberation and radical freedom approach and justice approach to repairing that wrong, it needs flipping the orientation of the discipline. And this may be uncomfortable for people who hold power in the field and end up having the possibility of taking so much space, not engaging in decolonial approaches and praxis, and still having so much legitimacy in our discipline.
Thanks. It's a fundamental point, which is like, who is this for? And actually, what are we defining as the sort of object of analysis? Because this actual question of determining what are we actually studying is fundamentally also subject to some of these dynamics that we want to get rid of. So what is is sort of Africa as a space the kind of object of analysis, or is this about Africa and the diaspora, as you say? So there's some very interesting questions emerging here. Zoe, did you want to jump in?
I'm happy to. I mean, I have so many thoughts. This is such a rich conversation, and I wish we were in person so that we could continue over breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I think, I want to build on Yolande's point, but also go back to your sort of original question of who's doing African studies. I wanted to kind of refer to some work that I did with a former grad student, Ian Russell, that was to quantify actually and to update some of our data on who's doing African studies across 25 African studies journals. And we looked at the gender and geographic breakdown. And we've seen a modest decline since 1985 in the representation in Western published, overwhelmingly Western published with some South African journals, a modest decline in scholars based in African countries on the continent. And we've seen an increase in women based outside of the continent. And so as a white woman, I think it's really important that I contribute to the knowledge about what we're actually existing within, what space I occupy, and how I can be of maximum service to disrupt structures of exploitative and oppressive and unequal power. And so one of the things that work has been pushing towards, and it's not yet published because life is difficult and Ian is patient, but there is a double burden on women in Africa to do transformative gatekeeping, to access positions of authority that open the academy and that do decolonial work, while being underrepresented in some of the key sort of benchmarks, the public sphere and publications in particular. And so that article tries to pinpoint that dilemma of who the burden falls on for, radical decoloniality. And I think Yolande has already mentioned gender. Gender is a serious problem. Race is a serious problem in how we think about who is doing African studies and who it's for. And I say that because I completely share Yolande's belief and value that it needs to center Africa and the diaspora. And I also have gone on a journey in my own thinking about what decoloniality really needs to look like, because I was brought into an editorial position on the journal Critical African Studies when I was far too young in the field, and ended up carrying a lot of the work to decolonize that journal. And I initially came in with this idea that representation and inclusion in spaces of white dominant European-centered power was what decolonization looked like. And through collaborative exchanges with amazing African women colleagues, I came to understand that actually accessing white dominated, gate-kept platforms that don't have access on the continent isn't always a priority for scholars based in Africa. It's not to say that it doesn't matter, but we all have our own sort of vision of who our public is and who we want to be in conversation with and for and accountable to. And so for me, I think that decolonizing, as much as it's about, being more accountable to African-led agendas and diasporic visibility and strengthening those transatlantic and honestly global connections, at this point, it is also very much for me a cause of justice and equity in the global north, because that's where I think white supremacy is most intractable. And that's where decolonization work will serve everyone. Like the idea that it only serves people in Africa, I think is a sort of misrepresentation of our power and where we're headed, that I believe it's ultimately liberatory for all, and it is only going to work if it shifts who sets the agenda.
Thanks for that. There's a kind of I sense a distinction between the kind of reformist view within African studies and a kind of much more unpacking certain power structures. So there's a question of accessing journals, for example, right? So I know lots of African studies journals are putting in ways of encouraging submissions from scholars from Africa. So this is a kind of inclusion within an existing power structure, but then there's the question of, is that structure itself something that should be reproduced, right? So there's a kind of question of the sufficiency of those types of approaches. And I say this also working in an African studies journal where we think about some of these issues as well. Sabelo, did you want to jump in quickly?
Okay, very briefly, I think there is question of what is African studies for who, or who is African studies for? I think such a question will never arise if it has not been for the dirty history of the field of African studies itself. So that needs to be, is not a question which just arises out of a vacuum. It's a question which arises out of a context in which African studies origins is actually associated with some dirty histories, which needs to be which the discipline or the field, I will prefer to call it the field, needs to be liberated from. And so one issue is what we have already alluded to, whereby there is this feeling that perhaps in African studies, Africans, when it it emerged, Africans were sort of objects of study rather than subjects of study. So there is that feeling, and that feeling you can see it, because it would be surprising. Why is it that after almost 60 years, then you see African scholars meeting in Ghana, in Accra, and forming the African Studies Association of Africa? Then you say, what is it that is at play here? There is a feeling really of the field being driven maybe from somewhere rather than from Africa. So there's that feeling among African scholars, and that feeling cannot be understood. It can be confusing, as some will say, unless you put it within the context of the history of the evolution of African studies. You will, and in that aspect of a dirty history, you will then think perhaps about Mutimbe's idea of the colonial library, which actually informed most of the representations of Africa, and what the people are trying to do, or what the African scholars are trying to do, is then to liberate themselves from colonial library, so that they really produce an African archive, and perhaps shift from the idea of Africa driven from outside, and they begin to make sure that at the center of African studies is an African idea of Africa. And that, I think, is an important aspect of it. And that is one. Two, after 1945, you will understand the context in which African studies then becomes part of another problematic area studies. And the complexities are so interesting in the sense that after 1945, if you looked at it from the context of the continent, that was a moment of possibilities in knowledge. There was a moment of possibilities that this is now we're decolonized, now we're going to be doing our own things. But during that same time, if you look at it from the global imperial designs, that is when they are bringing in the issue of these area studies. So you will see those two tensions at play there. And you will see perhaps the global power matrices actually capturing what appears like African studies for geopolitical reasons. And that's a level where you will need to liberate the African studies from that, so that it serves the African agenda, not the global imperial agenda. So there is that. And then there is also a feeling, perhaps among some African scholars, that in what is called the African studies, where is Africa? You remember Robtel Pile's question, where is Africa in this? You can go, and the students at is it the University of London who were saying, but we're doing a master's in African studies, but there was no Africa in what we were studying. So there are all these other questions which makes it this question of saying for who is this field, it becomes very prominent.
Thank you for that. I think this is an important question about, what is the knowledge for? Because this is fundamentally a question of producing knowledge. Where is it produced? But also, I think there is a critique within the sort of decolonial movement, which is a critique of the mobilization of knowledge, right? Is African studies a discipline that exists for Africans, or does it exist for us to better, in the global north, speak to policymakers and so on about Africa, right? To make representations of Africa in those particular kind of strategic ways. So this is very important. It's kind of fodder and food for thought. So last but not least, Awino, and then we can jump into the following discussion after your intervention.
Yeah, I would add that, in fact, it is an enterprise that's about framing Africa as a problem that needs to be understood better through global Western, and global here often means Western frameworks, right? So even though the field is suddenly or seemingly evolving, the continent still remains a site of inquiry as a site that's problematic. Like, how do we understand conflicts? What is it about our frameworks that is not working, What is it about these people that we need to figure out in the ways in which, ethno-nationalism and other kinds of, class-based systems are operating that, struggle with these frameworks that have worked in other parts of the world? So it's still a site of problems rather than a site within which you can understand that there's something actually wrong with your frameworks. If we understand, if these things are failing in this context, there's something about this context that's telling us that we need to imagine differently how peace building or conflict resolution can occur. But that's not the point I wanted to make. Who is it for? A few years after I landed in London, I misguidedly went to an ASA conference because some African colleagues wanted me to sit on a panel. And I walked into the university where the conference was being held, and I looked around and I was really confused, Philip, and I'm not joking. This was my first ASA conference, and I was like, what is going on here? It was majority white male. And there was also a very interesting dynamic that kept on happening. All of the panels where Africans were speaking, the room was filled with Africans, right? And a few, white colleagues who work very closely with Africans. But there was this also strange balkanization that was happening in this space. And this is not more than 3 years ago. So who is it for? You answer the question with that analogy that I've offered. The second point that I wanted to make is around, I think we must not confuse the marketplace of publishing, right? So people arriving at particular journals to do multiple things because, yes, you're stuck in an industry that requires you to publish or perish, or you're simply interested in putting particular ideas out, and that is the home that you have found. So I think we must be careful not to confuse folks who go and publish in African studies journals as necessarily framing their work as part of being, a thing that belongs in African studies, and instead look at it also as a thing about the marketplace of journals and how the publishing industry works. So you're going to send your idea to the place that is willing to take it sometimes, or negotiate slightly differently based on ratings and all of these crazy things that as academics we are pushing back against, but we're still having to negotiate around top tier journals and rankings and all of that. The final point that I wanted to make draws back to Yolande's argument about Africa and its diaspora. This is a very strong claim and charge that has been put to colleagues who do African studies work at SOAS, to say that when many students arrive at SOAS and register on an African studies degree program, they're interested in thinking about Africa in relation to the Black diaspora. And unfortunately, they're not experiencing that within those programs. So that is one issue. The second issue is the risk within degree programs that name themselves as African studies of not doing enough interdisciplinary work, right? In the sense that the way degree programs are structured, you have very sort of narrow interpretation of what African studies looks like, rather than enabling students to engage in a sort of inter and multidisciplinary approach to thinking about Africa that is happening across different parts of the university. So again, that's why I continue to push back around this thing of an African studies program, because it sets students up to imagine that they're coming to get something, then they don't get it. But also there's a demographic that goes to do African studies programs, Philip. That demographic mirrors my ASA UK conference experience.
This is a very important point about like how is it that the structures of the discipline or the structures of the field, right? However we label it, how do those actually match onto what African studies is, right? Like, is a field just its journals and its conferences? To some degree, that's where we see the power, right? And as your experience that we know at ASA and these types of places, we see precisely who holds the power and who doesn't. So this is a very important point about African studies as a field of study and how we actually sort of create programs around that. There's a question in the Q&A precisely about this, because we are creating a kind of interdisciplinary African studies program here at the University of Ottawa, and these are questions that are live about like, what do you even call this thing in order to actually label it correctly, and in order to create and avoid reproducing certain power dynamics that have plagued other similar programs of that name. So I think the fact that reflection is even happening is probably a step in the right direction. So thank you all for your help in kind of analyzing this question of what it even means to decolonize, what that entails. And I think that moves us really nicely into this second phase of discussion, which is what is it that there is in terms of the linkages between the scholarship and activism and practice, because I think this is a point that Yolande made very early in the previous discussion, which was that there's 100 years of mobilization around this, right? So this is not just about writing in journals, but this is also about the relationship between scholarship and activism. I think we see this in movements like Roads Must Fall, for example. We also have institutional efforts at things like equality, diversity, inclusion. In the Canadian context, lots of efforts to indigenize the curriculum, for example. So my question to all of you is, how should decolonial movements in African studies and beyond interact with some of these initiatives in terms of things like equality, diversity, and inclusion, and so on? And what is the place of perhaps more radical work in activism outside the academy? So perhaps I can go in the opposite order this time, so we can begin with Awino and then finish with Yolande.
Thanks. So I think that, there's often that risk of conflating decolonizing work with diversity and inclusion work. All of those things are very important, but they do different things. But I do want to emphasize that the intersection and needing to hold the questions of inclusivity and diversity as part of the decolonizing process is very important. And I want to share my own experiences of teaching in the UK. The number of times students come up to me who are students who have studied in the United Kingdom, who come up to me and say that I'm the first Black person who has taught them in the entire education experience. And I only teach postgraduate classes, says something, right? Because presence, visibility of Black scholars in the classroom is as much as about the fact that they exist, and therefore you should be giving them jobs and hiring them and retaining them in the university, but it's also about who is constructed as a knower, who is constructed as a person who is shaping knowledge, who is influencing knowledge transfer processes and knowledge production processes. So to do decolonizing work of necessity requires thinking deeply about how our universities look, and to think deeply about the structures in the university that continuously create conditions that make Black scholars, Black students within universities feel like outsiders. Because it doesn't matter if you have 10 or 15 or 30 or 60 Black academics, if the university still continues to invite or create conditions that do not invite a diverse student body, our experiences as Black academics are not necessarily going to be better, right? Because if we think critically about our positionalities, the kinds of dynamics we are going to encountering in the classrooms, the kinds of claims that are currently being made in the UK, for instance, about erasing or removing critical race theory, from instance, from teaching, or trying to push back against scholarship and teaching that is asking very critical questions around the legacies of colonialism and the ways in which imperialism is functioning in the world today as being problematic teaching, says a lot about institutional structures, the importance of diversity as part of a broader conversation on decolonizing knowledge. Because again, you hear it from students that it's not enough, to have a diverse reading list. And a reading list is just one of many things that you do, right? How that material is taught is also very important, because somebody can go and pepper the reading list. You wanted Black people, okay, they're there, but how that material is taught ends up being more problematic than what is actually raised in that literature, or a sort of, the classical tactic that patriarchs would do with women's political participation, right, and affirmative action. So you said you want more women in parliament, okay, I'll go and get my girlfriend and my secretary to run for office, therefore undermining the very intention of what that affirmative action is. So that's the same way you can find somebody who will go and look for the least critical scholarship on a particular subject to prove the point that adding Africans or adding Black people to the syllabus is not going to make a difference. Look at what they're writing. So I think as such a very complex and multi-sectoral approaches are required, but we must hold inclusion and diversity as part of the conversation.
Thank you so much for that. I think it reflects a lot of, I don't know, I'll sort of editorialize here, but a lot of kind of personal questions and thinking I've had about this, which is, on one side, we do need the kind of sort of empirical numbers in some sense. We do need better data. We do need better inclusion, right? And I think Zoe made a point earlier about sort of we count, like how many people are actually doing this, where are people writing, who is included and who isn't. But then there's also this question of like inclusion is necessary but insufficient when it's done on terms that are just simply not functional or don't actually affect power relations in any kind of significant way. So yeah, that's very important. So I'll move to Sabelo now.
The question of diversity and the social inclusion, I think we need to think about that one in context. It varies per context. It depends which context we are talking about. For the past 19 years, I've been working in South Africa, and it was a specific context in which the issue of diversity and the issue of social inclusion meant a number of things within a context in which institutions of higher education were fragmented into English, Afrikaner, Bantu, and then at the same time, you find that within the institutions at the professorial level, it was a particular people of a particular race and a particular gender who were dominant. And then in such a context, the issue of diversity and the social inclusion really touched on issues of changing the demographics itself, while it does not actually take us far, but it is necessary. So that's one. Two, I think when we think about it, we need also to think, maybe go back to Fanon's concept of the European game. That the other issue which we need to take seriously is that diversity and the inclusion must not actually be just about joining the European game, because that can create problems. And again, we need to think also within context and within history, whereby in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, there was a very quick movement in terms of changing the demographics. Vice Chancellor is Black, the professoriate is Black, the increased access of Black students into the university. But does that mean, therefore, we've decolonized? I don't think it means that. It means perhaps we moved into the game, but we did not challenge the rules of the game. Perhaps now the issue is, how do we challenge the rules of the game? And then my last input is also, the issue of representation is important, but representation must not actually amount to symbolism. There must actually be substance to it. So these are some of the issues which arise when you think about the issue of diversity and the issue of social inclusion.
Thank you for that. This point about the kind of European game is really interesting as a kind of contrast to this to the fact of inclusion and diversification, right? We see that they're kind of insufficient conditions for structural changes. And I think when we move to our kind of final discussion in a few minutes, this is really, I think, helpful for thinking through what institutions and what structures actually are we concerned with when we think about decolonizing. So, but before we move into that discussion, we do have to hear from Zoe and Yolande. So Zoe, do you have something to chip in on this question?
I always have something to chip in, but I'll try to keep it short. So I wanted to build quickly on Sabelo's point about what I think of as the sort of assimilationist approach, and you called it earlier, Philippe, like a reformist agenda or reformist set of practices. And I just wanted to give an example of my current experiences at my current institution. So I was trained in the UK and have moved through different positions on the academic totem pole, from postdoc to tenured, now non-tenured. And I really often am guided by sort of two key thinkers in my work and life. And one is bell hooks and the other is Audre Lorde. And so to start with Audre Lorde's quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." I think a lot about this sort of representational moves that Owino was talking about that are sort of used to neutralize claims making rather than to transform. And that's really visible when we see kind of demands for tenure that don't disrupt the hierarchy, when women and scholars of color are much more represented at the lowest levels and in the most sort of marginal or insecure employment positions within the academy. And I'm focusing specifically on faculty as these knowers and knowledge sharers, right? And so that, I think, is a fundamental tension, and one that we need to just continue to name in the spirit of repetition, to Sabella's earlier point. I also wanted to make one rhetorical move, which is that I'm trying increasingly to talk about exclusion rather than inclusion. And I think that helps to focus our gaze on what are the mechanisms, the roadblocks, the asymmetries in access to resources or other forms of privilege that lead to patterns of perpetual exclusion, even when we've seen these allegedly historic transformations in society and politics. And then the last two points really quickly is I do think that we need to always be rigorously intersectional, and that really requires intersectionality thinking that focuses on multiple dimensions of exclusion, right? I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw's theory is grounded in the law for a reason. It's because there are tools used to create blind spots that really need to be pinpointed intersectionally in order to be resolved. And that requires, lastly, access to power and influence and the ability to thrive. And so this is where, going back to my sort of shout out to Bell Hooks's Black feminist theory, her foundational theoretical position is to move from the margin to move the margin to the center. And that's, I think, how people can do intersectional work, is that you have to really begin to focus on these exclusionary practices, focus on whether or not we're relying on the master's tools to kind of prop up these systems of exploitation where exclusion has value, right? That's why tenure is not just valuable because of the job security, it's also valuable because other people don't have it. And so if that's the system that we live within, then we need to continue to name it so that people are willing to share power where there is actually diversity.
Thanks for that. I think the point that the way that you play with this dynamic of inclusion and exclusion, I think, is really helpful, because for me, it makes me think of how universities are very conservative institutions in some ways, very sort of exclusionary of particular forms of knowing, especially when we think about access to academic freedom and access to sort of job security and these types of things. And yet universities are also these sort of sites of mobilization against other forms of exclusion. So like, I think, for example, within the Canadian Association of African Studies, we push really hard on the Canadian government around questions of visa denials for accessing, African scholars accessing our annual conference. And so there's this kind of strange tension within the academy that there's lots of push to enable greater access, greater inclusion, but the kind of endeavor as a whole has these interesting exclusionary dynamics as well within it. So thank you for that. And so last but not least, Yolande, and then we'll move after that to our kind of final phase.
Thank you. I want to thank all three panelists for really actually expanding the way also I'm thinking about the relationship between diversity and inclusion and the relationship with decoloniality. I think I want to make maybe 3 or 4 quick points, going back to what does it mean to diversify a reading list and who's included on the reading list. Another challenge with using that approach as an end of it all is even when you diversify the reading list with Black, Indigenous, or people of color, you also tend to risk of simply including similar philosophical orientation about how to approach the discipline. And that does not necessarily lend to thinking about the field, whatever discipline you're in otherwise. So I can have a Black person write about nuclear power and know, but in the very same way that that person's been trained, and not necessarily engaging in asking different types of questions about how the field can be different. So this kind of pedagogical approach to diversifying the reading list does not necessarily encourage our students to think about the field they're in a different way. So one of the things that, and I actually can't argue that my pedagogical approaches are dramatically decolonial. right? Because my intellectual point of departure remains to a certain extent very much how I've been trained. What I try to do with my students and spend maybe the first third or quarter of the semester deconstructing how do we know what we know. And I'm hoping that by giving them these tools, I can equip them to be more critical in their future academic endeavors. But because of the type of classes that I teach, by the time I encounter these students and we walk together on this path of challenging the way knowledge is produced, they've already gone through, 4 years or 6 years of academic indoctrination or engagement, and sometimes it shocks them because they say, "I didn't know this about the field. I did not know this about academia." And they feel cheated. So I think this type of approach is not simply about diversifying the reading list in terms of the names, but creating avenues where we encourage students to understand the political economy of knowledge production, to understand how power shapes what we know and how we know it. And then the second point that is actually completely different with regards to diversity and inclusion is I'm with the advent of the revolution this last summer, the revolution for Black Lives. We've seen in northern universities in the UK, in North America, US, and Canada, kind of this push to hire more Black people, to hire for Black studies, African studies, critical international relations, decolonial. I mean, you have all these titles, right? And these jobs are often associated with the need to hire Black people. And I applaud it. I'm very excited about it because it's sometimes you need a shock to the system. My question though is, will Black scholars, after this wave, after this trend disappears, will Black scholars who simply want to study 18th century British literature be able to be hired in those positions, right? Will a Black person, regardless of their born in Africa or of the diaspora, be able to be hired to study norms of governance in NATO? Yeah, so like the practices of hiring in this moment are definitely needed, but are we thinking long-term about what it will mean in terms of hiring expectations? Because what it can inadvertently lead to, that when we're entering the academy or the institution, the university, to start working on issues of inclusivity and diversity and decolonizing our departments, the labor will automatically then put on the shoulders of these Black individuals we've hired for that very purpose, right? And that in itself becomes a bit vicious in what we're trying to achieve and what we're actually doing, the processes through which we're actually trying to achieve these ends. So I think we need to think critically in our hopes to decolonize on one hand, and diversify on the other hand, even though they're linked to a certain extent, that we don't reproduce the exploitative practices of laying the labor on the shoulders of a particular group. And lastly, very briefly, I want to bring about the issue of performance, and how detrimental it becomes to aspirations of doing things otherwise. Some institutions and some scholars kind of embrace the language of diversity, embrace the language of decolonization, embrace the language of decentering Eurocentric approaches to knowledge production, discursively, but in their very practice of it all, right? And actually what they do on a day-to-day, they don't always have the same critical approach. They can point out to the system, but how do they actually engage with their colleagues, with their students, with their research collaborators, doesn't always actually mirror what they critically write and what they critically talk about. And this is something that I have had to think about myself in terms of my advocacy and my work. To what extent do I perform the language of decoloniality and diversity, but how do I actually apply it on the day-to-day? And this is the tricky part about this field of this conversation. It goes beyond intellectualizing and articulating it. How you treat your colleagues, how you treat your friends in the discipline, how you treat your students, what kind of classroom spaces are we creating to encourage not only the discourse of decoloniality, but the praxis in research projects, in interrogations, in academic spaces. So if we close the door to doing that work in our very small circle, but perform it on the public, we're also not doing the work. And so I love these panels because they push me to think more critically, to engage with scholars who are doing the work. But once we turn off our Zoom cameras, it is actually what we do that tells more and has much more of an impact than the articulation of these challenges.
Thank you for the note of self-critique is always good, because I think that especially if we're positioned in universities, it's essential for us to do that. And I take your point about this kind of, I know this is not how you described it, but it's kind of the danger of kind of ghettoization of these kinds of approaches, right? That in a sense that it's possible to just kind of do lots of kind of diversification in terms of knowledge without really doing the difficult work in terms of even questions of political economy within a university that are fundamentally actually much more challenging and potentially existential to the institution. So I get the sense that this may even overlap with questions around marketization of higher education, right? That diversification and decolonization contribute to what we could call a kind of a more rigorous and diverse student experience and all these types of things. But as long as it doesn't touch the university endowment, as long as it doesn't touch all these other questions that are actually about sort of power of institutions. So there's a lot to think through here. So speaking of institutions, that's our kind of final point of discussion today, which is about institutions and strategies. So I think we have about 10 minutes before we kind of jump into Q&A. I'm thinking about, a lot of my thinking and kind of thinking through this panel was about journals and the ways that journals kind of reckon with questions of coloniality. And I was reading through the editorial, I think it was an African Studies review about whiteness in African studies. And so there's lots of critique happening in these different institutions. So my question to all of you is, what institutions in the academy are actually best placed, if any, to decolonize? And can today's structures be the bearers of structural change? So perhaps I'll begin with Awino again, and we kind of move backwards through the list.
Thanks. When Yolande was speaking, it reminded me of a colleague who said how they were hired for a job that had race in it. It was something and race, and the Black woman was hired. Then a few months later, the same job description went out without race, and a white person was hired for the job. I think that's something to think with. In terms of institutions, my position has always been, if we are going to do true decolonizing work, then the very structure and nature of the university will cease to exist. If we do true decolonizing work, then we are no longer seated in a university earning salaries, publishing, doing research in the ways that matter to the metrics that give us promotions, etc. We are no longer setting assignments, marking, doing academic advising. We are not doing that. So even as students often make these demands of decolonizing, I say, true decolonizing means, hey, don't come and ask me why you failed and got 58, because we are no longer recognizing that as a way of engaging with knowledge production. Yeah, we can all sit around in the quad, do teach outs and engage with knowledge production in that sort of organic and authentic way. So for me, what we are doing right now is just moving the chess pieces on the board. But true decolonizing means thinking outside of the very university structure itself and disbanding that. And there's been a very interesting initiative that came out here in the UK over the summer called the Free Black University, which is literally an attempt to do this, to think about expanding access to knowledge, not intellectual work in its diversity, and thinking about ways of knowledge transfer outside the very structure of university systems, and targeted at communities that historically and continue to be excluded from top tier universities, for instance, here in the United Kingdom. That for me is a vision of where we need to be going, because it radically alters how we think of the very, very infrastructure of knowledge production, knowledge transfer, and knowledge generation. So anything that we do at the moment is tinkering with the pieces. But let me just give a shout out to a project that I've always found as an important intervention in thinking about journals, for instance. So Feminist Africa, a journal that was set up at the African Gender Institute, initiated by Amina Mama and a team of other people, was designed to create a journal that would enable and hold African feminist scholarship from Africa and in the diaspora, free open access, which means that there's immense amount of labor that's going on in the background to raise the resources so that this can be open access. And the sort of fits and starts of Feminist Africa's growth has been impacted by that, back-breaking work of financial fundraising and keeping the vision of an open access journal that centers African feminist scholarship from the continent and the diaspora, and also centers an engagement with African feminist movements as important interlocutors in thinking about intellectual knowledge. Thanks.
This is a very interesting point about the kind of existential threat to our entire kind of knowledge enterprise, the institutionalized kind of pursuit of knowledge, if we actually truly follow through on these questions of decolonization. So I think that's really getting to this question of the university as a credentialing and symbolic capital attribution device, that maybe if we actually push through some of these questions of decolonizing the academy, is kind of in the crosshairs of that. So thank you. That's really, really helpful. Sabelo?
Thank you. My ideas on this one are not yet very clear, but let me try to throw something out. I think the first point regards the university as an institution. Can the very idea of the university be really changed into something else? The turning of the university into a site of struggle, what does it tell us? Does it tell us that people want to destroy the university, or does it tell us that people like the university but a particular type or particular idea of the university? That's one. Two, I said in a review of some of the programs within the context of decolonizing recently, and one of the alumni of a prominent university was also part of those people whom we interviewed. And this person actually said, he was very aggressive towards the university itself, saying the university, I've learned that this is a very terrible space. But one of the colleagues who was with us in the panel then said, don't you think that critical mind which you have comes from the fact that you passed through a university? So if that is true, therefore, don't you think there's value in maintaining a university? I don't have an answer, but I thought let me put that down there. Then my second and the last comment is regarding the issue of journals. I think that's a broader question of the global economy of knowledge. And as somebody who really developed his career in the global south, I actually can speak from experience that the major problem about being located where I was located, that hierarchical nature of where do you publish your work. We all, without somebody carrying a weapon, we all know where to publish for recognition, for status, for promotion, and that structure is still there. That structure is still there, and it's very hard to really. I don't have the answers on how to subvert it. The major problem, perhaps those who are established are the ones who can freely subvert it. But the younger ones who are coming up, it's very hard to do that because they need to build the career. The system won't collapse today. And then lastly, during the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, I went through almost all the universities in South Africa speaking about decolonization. And in one of the universities, I gave a presentation, a public lecture, and immediately the president of SRC went to the podium when I came down, and they said, the professor has spoken, we need to ban the university. It looks like he has proven that this is a useless institution. I had to go back immediately to try to say, no, I don't think that was the I don't think that was the message. And I ended up under a lot of pressure to say, can we develop a strategy of resisting while complying for our own sanity and for our own lives? And I want to live with that.
Thank you. Yeah, this idea of resisting while complying is very familiar, I think, within a kind of academic context, especially when we try and think about structural change, the structures are so diffuse, right? You know, like promotion and all these types of things are decided by anonymous peers, right? A lot of this is determined by people in other universities, right? So there's lots of kind of very diffuse veto points that make structural change very, very difficult to kind of pinpoint. So yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful. So Zoe?
Sure, it's such an honor to be on this panel and to be amongst thought leaders in the field. I've learned so much from all of your writing. So I wanted to make sure while we're on the last question, as time begins to dwindle, that I had an opportunity to just thank you all for your brilliance and for letting me participate. I wanted to uplift my colleague. He's a doctoral student at the business school here at Harvard, Lumumba Seegers, who really elegantly framed, I think, what we're talking about. And he was talking, we were having a conversation about sort of students and how to serve and transform our very, very elitist and over-resourced institution. And he said, you know, Harvard exists in a community that exists in the world. And so we see within ourselves the same sort of dilemmas and problems. It is not, the academy doesn't exist outside of it, right? This is, as much as we talk about the ivory tower and our own sort of aloofness or irrelevance, whether that's good or bad, it is an institution that's within the world. And so when I have my, you know, morning ritual of overthinking, I always arrive at the same conclusions that Owino did. And yet I also think, to Sabella's point, when, you know, we're having this conversation because at some level we love what the university or intellectual life, whatever institutional label it has, can make possible for imagining new futures and for, you know, fomenting activist work. So when I see students in a sit-in in the administration building, that means that there's something about the institution that is working because the students are there and they're trying to change it. And so I think it's a mistake to think that activism is somehow antithetical to or not actually the purpose of these critical spaces and of our intellectual pursuits. And I certainly would rue the day that the university becomes just another capitalist commodity. We have a lot of capitalism within it. And you mentioned market forces in the question, but to me, you know, it's rather a question of how can we buttress ourselves against the worst excesses of a totally transactional and extractive political economy. There are three frameworks that I rely on a lot, and you know, they're different, but the distinctions aren't important for this sort of final comment. I think a lot about dilemmas, and I don't know if it's because I'm a Libra or what have you, but dilemma thinking I think is really important particularly for any white audience members or anybody who has an excess of privilege and is trying to do emancipatory work. The dilemma is this. The dilemma is if you refuse resources, then you can't move money. If you move money, then you're not necessarily doing mutuality. And so there are all sorts of ways that I think decoloniality is fraught with these dilemmas of how do we show up. And to, you know, some of the other points that have been raised today, if you are not a white scholar, but rather you're an African scholar based on the continent, you're a, you know, Black, Indigenous, person of color scholar based in a white supremacist society in the global North, there are always dilemmas. How much do you serve yourself? How much do you push against the system? How much do you spend your time and your resources trying to fight for change? And particularly for junior scholars, there are some really eye-watering challenges. Do you share space, or do you provide yourself with opportunities to connect up? You know, it was only this year or last year that I realized that most of my strategic thinking colleagues invite senior people when they get to extend invitations for seminar series, or when you have this sort of thing that you have to do to convene people, because they want letter writers, they want people to speak on their behalf. And it had just not occurred to me, because I thought that my obligation was to expand who has access and who has part of the platform that I can create. And so, you know, those are dilemmas, but they're not excuses for paralysis, and nor are they excuses for erasing oneself. And I think that that's really important. So the other two kind of reference points that I hold on to is knowledge reparations, which is how do you use knowledge to transform past injustice. And a concrete example of how I'm doing that is trying to actually help my students write for public audiences, and to have future thinking as part of my, you know, syllabus, that we don't end today, we end in the future. The syllabus, the course, it's future oriented. And then mutuality, or entanglement for me is really important, because it acknowledges the messiness and the fact that I'll never be able to make everyone happy, because I can't do all of the decolonial maneuvers simultaneously because of these contradictions, because of the sort of nature of epicoloniality, how power reproduces itself. And so then you just have to sit with our commitments to one another, and to keep showing up, and to take feedback, and to transform, and to iterate. And so that is why, for me, the university is the place where I can do that the most, is because it is a learning institution, which means that I can continue learning.
Thank you for that. I think this thought about mutuality is really helpful. I think in the context of when we think about resources, not just the sort of political economy of money and research funding, but also of recognition, right? So I think of, for example, the use of research assistants on big projects on Africa. It's not just about the salary, it's also about the recognition in terms of authorship, in terms of inclusion in that respect. So these very sort of small practices that enact this ethos that you mentioned of kind of mutual endeavor. And last but not least, Yolande, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Thank you. This is a question that, now that I have a tenure track position, I am thinking a little bit more. I thought I understood the academy because I spent so much of my life in it. And even in different visiting positions, I thought I understood it, but I'm realizing how little I knew about the different pieces that move within these institutions, that serve different interests and imperatives for different groups of people. And now I'm sitting in a place of humility, because you're asking a question about what these institutions, what's the role of these institutions in moving pieces forward. And I'm realizing that I actually know very little about these institutions and how they work. I haven't been in them long enough to know all the ways in which politics operates, to hold particular positions of power intact, but while appearing to shift the status quo in more visible ways. So my strategy at the moment as a junior scholar in my institution is to understand the importance of lifting where you stand. And one of the things that has been bothering me is this issue of access to resources, and not simply trying to expand the pie, but changing the mold altogether. I have constant conversations as someone in a Canadian institution. I have numerous conversations about the visa structure and how it impacts which kind of graduate student can be financed and who cannot be financed, right? The way it works is the Canadian government finances a lot of the graduate studies work, but if you're an international student, you will get, unless your university has an endowment that it can pay for a lot of international students, there's not, the incentive system doesn't make it necessarily lucrative to welcome a lot of international students. Another way in which I struggle with our institutions is in terms of intellectual property when I'm engaging in collaborative work, ensuring that when I go through an IRB process and I'm devising a project with people that are going to be based in an African country as collaborators, everybody's on the same page that the data belongs to all. Yeah. And it's not just a question of them accessing the data or them accessing the publication spaces, but it's trying to push against this idea that, the university wants to protect its intellectual property. Everything I produce somehow belongs to the university. And those who are outside, even though I co-created or I co-cultivated the knowledge with community and other members of my academic network, are not in the university, my university, and protected by the rules of my university. I want to make sure that I fight for them even where I stand. And I haven't perfected the art because I'm still learning how it works, So when I think about access, I think about how do you break the mold? How do you push back where you stand about changing rules for funding, not just expending the funding? How do we create different types of incentives to allow more international students, to allow a more equitable space to share knowledge across different localities by diminishing this power asymmetry between those who get the funding predominantly in the West and those who receive the funding predominantly in the African countries where we're operating. And as we're working with our colleagues, understanding that I'm on a 2-2 load on, when I'm past renewal, I'll be on a 2-2 load. And the summer are relatively free. I have children, but they're relatively free to do the work that I love. While my colleagues in, sometimes Nairobi, in Dar, or, in other places are going to be marking through the summer, right? How do I look at these institutional imbalances in the very small ways to push for change? So how do I compensate for institutional power imbalances for a more equitable engagement in collaborative research? So I actually don't have that much to say about how to change the institutions. But what I do believe in is the importance of lifting where I stand, and sometimes it's pitting myself against the smaller institutions I interact with to push for change. And then ultimately creating communities, intellectual communities and activist communities across borders to think more critically and more see in terms of an action plan on how we can change the institutions. Because before we achieve the big changes, we have to be able to enact the small ones where we operate.
Thank you. I think I'm going to quickly summarize a couple of the questions that we've received, because I sense a couple of themes there that many of our Q&A, many of the questions that are coming in are about some of these questions about what do we do with African studies? Where is it going? There's a question about can we think of a future where African studies is debated as a thing of the past? There are also questions about what do we reconstruct? And so since we're a bit low on time, perhaps I could ask you to respond to the following kind of synthesis question in about a minute each, which is, do we get rid of African studies as a field? If so, what's supposed to be in its place? So I'll start with Awino, and then we work our way back, and then we'll wrap up probably just after 10:30.
Because it's a Friday and I want to be provocative, I will say yes, get rid of African studies. And there's nothing to put in its place, because Africans are doing scholarship on Africa and its diaspora seated in other disciplines. There's a lot of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work happening. And I guess to reimagine it is to remove it out of that cocoon and to, erase, again, I go back to erase its original sin and think about knowledge on Africa, knowledge from Africa, knowledge about Africa as knowledge that already exists outside of African studies, as knowledge that needs to be put in the service of rethinking our global challenges and rethinking our global concerns today. African studies is still preoccupied very deeply, as far as I'm concerned, with understanding Africa as a problem. As part of decolonizing, I think there are efforts to, sort of do much more inclusionary or visibility work to say, here are Africans writing about a series of things, but Africans and Black people are writing in other disciplines. If you get rid of it, we've lost nothing. The scholarship will still exist, but it will be thriving in other places. And we'll be opening ourselves up to greater transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work. And that's where the magic happens. That's where the work of freedom, imagination, and freer futures will emanate from. Thanks, Philip.
Thanks for the Friday provocation. I definitely will carry that into the weekend. Thanks for that. Sabelo?
I'm not sure where to start, but I can also draw from the experience on the continent where you have universities with institutes of African studies. Perhaps those institutes existing as townships within a city, and that existence, it's a testimony to something that perhaps what is happening in the disciplines might not be really about Africa. It might be about something else. Hence, remember when Kwame Nkrumah pushed for the African Institute of African Studies in Ghana, it was after a realization that the whole faculties and the colleges were doing something else which had not much to do with the effect of the African people. So I'm not sure that before we make sure that what is done in other fields, in other disciplines, is about Africa, we can actually then abolish African studies. I think we need to first of all do a proper analysis of whether what is done in law, what is done in history is really about Africa or is something else. Because in the discipline where I'm trained, which is history, which is African history, the very idea of history and the very philosophy of history is not African at all. Even if we have changed the historiography, meaning the actors within the drama, we now put Africans to act, but the stage is not set by us. So there's still some work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Zoe?
I'll be very quick at the risk of using a metaphor on a Friday. I think I like Sabella's, idea of the township, and I caution to Owino's point, which I'm very sympathetic to. Owino, you're always totally convincing to me, no matter what it is you're saying, it seems. But I worry a bit about gentrifying the township, right, to use that metaphor, because what is often published about Africa in my discipline, such as it is of political science, it requires smoothing over, scrubbing out, erasing the nuance and the context and the richness and the distinction that African studies has often provided for me as an intellectual, like dual home. And so I think that there is something really to be mindful of. I'm all for, the sort of dandelion in the wind approach of all of the wonderful scholarship that happens under this original sin, but I also think that there is space for specificity and context that is not embraced in other parts of social science. And so I'm familiar with grad students saying, well, I can't make this paper just about Africa, right? Or I need to use these tropes of how we talk about African conflict. I need to use ethnicity because it's what the reviewers want to see to be published outside of African studies. Whereas within African studies, you can't just say ethnic conflict. You need to justify how you're engaging with, decades of critique. So that's the part that I want to hold on to.
Thank you for that. Yeah, the terms of engagement are very much set by this legacy that we have. Yolande, I'll give you the final words, and then we're basically done.
I look at disciplines in terms of what we want them to become today as, a place where we can explore Africa the continent, however it was imagined, and by whom it was imagined, and for whom it was imagined, as something that I'm hoping that a field of African studies would open the possibilities to understand Africa better, not only for Westerners, but most importantly, for Africans themselves. Because I think in the process of decolonization, one of the most tragic thing that happened with colonialism is Africans not forgetting, but being pushed to forcibly forget who they are as a people. So I think the orientation of an African studies program for me is much more for Africans to reclaim, their knowledge, their ways of understanding themselves than what it should have for in terms of value for others. And that's a different orientation, and I respect those who may not agree with that. But I also think and wonder whether fields like African studies or other Middle Eastern studies are end in and of themselves. Right? What is the objective if we want to do things otherwise for the discipline? I would like to have a dream where it would be no longer necessary to have a discipline called African studies, because the elements that we get out of it, the ways of knowing, the ways of understanding the world, and the peoples within that particular framing of the field would be infused in everything else that we learn. Because under the umbrella of African studies, you have literature, you have politics, you have humanities, and just I even sat on panels on psychology. What is it about their home field that doesn't necessarily allow them to feel at home in their respective disciplines? Just like gender studies, I work in gender and politics, and I definitely love that space. But what I would love to see is the end of the necessity to have these fields ghettoized in their own places. So should we get rid of African studies? I'm hoping that we get to a place where we no longer need to have that particular intellectual space. Because when I would walk into a class on the politics of war, my students would know enough about where to get to what they need to know about African, empires and state making and consolidation of power on its own terms, and maybe, but maybe not, in comparison with other places around the world, without necessarily having to orient themselves exclusively in an African studies field. So my hope, and I probably will not be alive to see it, and it may not ever happen, is that we no longer need to have this umbrella of African studies that is a melting, not even a melting pot, it's like a soup of all these disciplines that people who go there mostly because they don't feel at home in their own respective places. And if we have that, I think African studies is not an end in itself, but a conduit to where we're trying to go in academia.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a really helpful image. This idea of a kind of intellectual home, right? It's a home that we hope we don't have to go back to, but it's a home for us in the meantime. So thank you. That's a very good way for us to end off, I think. So I apologize that we didn't have more time to tackle more questions today. Our conversation was just too good, right? So I think I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We were really blessed to have all of you. I'd like to thank the Center for International Policy Studies as well for making this event possible in this month. So thank you to Yolande Bouka, Zoe Marks, Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, and Awino Okech. We've been very privileged to have you and benefit from your time as well. I'm happy that this was on a Friday. We get to finish the week this way and carry through some of these questions and discussions into the weekend. So thank you all again for coming. Thanks to everyone who participated and asked very, very important questions. And I hope to see you all again soon.